Hey guys, it's Alex Martin, the host of Sidewalk Science Center at the Bradenton Riverwalk here in Bradenton, Florida. And today I kind of want to do a little bit of an extension video to the last video, which was using the stars as a map to guide yourself through the sky and even be able to tell direction from the stars that you can see. So last time we talked about kind of, what's in the north and northeast part of the sky, but for this part of the video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Orion, and then also, how you can use the planets that are visible to kind of point you in a direction that you want to be going. And so, yeah, I'll kind of be talking about that. I'll reference both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere because these kind of, have two different orientations to them, just based on which direction you're facing relative to the equator. So with the constellation that we are about to lose, Orion, there's the familiar Orion's belt. And Orion's belt is that row of three stars that, if you look off one way, they point one direction, then they point another direction. Up here in the northern hemisphere, Orion's belt, if you go to the left, if you go more to the east from Orion's belt in a straight line, you run into the brightest star in the entire night sky, which we mentioned earlier in another video, which is the star Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star. It's about when Venus, the planet Venus, is at its fullest, brightest magnitude, Sirius is about 13 times less bright than Venus. So Sirius, even though it's the brightest star that we can see with our naked eye, is not as bright as the planet Venus when Venus is at its highest place in the sky. So Sirius is to the east of Orion's belt, and that's pointing in one direction. But then, if you find Orion's belt again, Orion's belt, when you follow it up to the west, or from the northern hemisphere that's off to the right, Orion's belt points directly at the constellation of Taurus. And then if you go even further up past Taurus, you will eventually hit the Pleiades cluster, the Seven Sisters as it's sometimes nicknamed. So with a telescope, it can be difficult to see the Seven Sisters. You actually need a different kind of wide field scope to see them all in one go. But if you're looking at them with the naked eye, if you're looking at the Seven Sisters, you find Orion's belt, then you just follow it past Taurus, which is like a V in the sky. Then you go up even further, and it's difficult to see under light pollution conditions, but I find that if you look a little bit off to the side of the Pleiades, you see this fuzzy kind of patch up there. You see a fuzzy patch. And with binoculars, I love looking at the Pleiades with binoculars because you get to really see just this cluster of stars up there, and you have your 6 to 7 prominent stars in that cluster. So it is a good tool moving from Sirius to Orion's belt to the Taurus constellation up to the Pleiades. That's all in that single straight line. So if you can find Orion, which we are leaving, this side of springtime, we're in the later half of springtime. So Orion is starting to set, we're losing it. It is a prominent winter constellation, not a summer constellation. So Sirius is much further off to the west towards sunset at dark than it was even, in December, January, February, and March. But let's talk about the planets now, because the planets are the special ones. If there's a planet out, it's passing through a certain part of the sky depending on where you live. And we've all heard of the zodiac constellations, which are your familiar ones like Taurus, like I just mentioned. But then for me, if you know like Scorpius, there's Sagittarius, Cancer, Libra, all those different ones. Those are the familiar 12 to 13 that we talk about when we reference the zodiac constellations. These constellations are special simply because of the planets. If the planets were at any other angle of tilt in the solar system, there would be a different set of constellations that would be special relative to our place here on Earth. But it's because all the planets in the solar system are lying across a pretty flat line in their orbit, varying only by a couple degrees here and there, but nothing too spectacular. Like, there is some separation, but they are very much on this flat disk around the sun. So you don't have any of the major planets that are going up and around like this, whereas all the others are going like this. They are all moving counterclockwise on a nearly flat incline. So Mars tends to deviate some of the most. But then, you have the planet Pluto. Pluto, you know, is a dwarf planet. It doesn't have enough mass to clear the debris through its orbit, and it also does not orbit that counterclockwise direction on a perfectly flat plane. It actually has a very sweeping up and down kind of orbit, so it's very tilted to the rest of the solar system. This is part of the reason why it got demoted to a dwarf planet, but it's all a game of definitions. But we have to adhere to these definitions in order to keep sound science. So when you're looking at the planets, right now in this direction, so there's the sun, which means that Venus is somewhere right around here. So Venus is directly above the sun at the moment, slightly off to the right maybe, but then you also have Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars all rising pre-dawn. Right around, at this point, it's about 2:45 that Jupiter is rising, and then Mars is about an hour or so later, somewhere in there, I think. But when you see Jupiter, it's that really bright one, it's very similar to Venus. Then you have Saturn, and then you have Mars. You're gonna see that they are all within a very close line to each other. They're all very, very nearby on that tilted plane. So if this is Jupiter, and then Saturn's right over here, and then Mars is over here, it's not like Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. It's very, very close together on a single line. And something cool about this is that this means that due to their inclination of their orbit, that when another planet, such as Venus, passes by them, they have a conjunction, which means that Venus will pass very, very closely to these other planets, as we saw back in November and December. In November, I think it was on November 24th of 2019, Venus and Jupiter came really close together and split farther apart. And then in December, I think it was December 26th, somewhere around there, of 2019, Venus eventually made its way up to Saturn and did the exact same thing. They got really close and then spread further apart, and then Jupiter set, couldn't see it anymore. Saturn set, you couldn't see it anymore. And then Venus has been here, you know, it's nearing May now, and Venus is still very high in the sky, but it is beginning to drop. If you pay attention to the time that Venus sets every night, it is becoming earlier and earlier and earlier. Then you have Mars. So with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, you know, as they come around, they are all following that line. And then if we talk about the moon, because that's what I meant to talk about a second ago, we have the moon going in its orbit around the Earth. And if you've been paying attention to the moon passing by Venus, you'll notice that it started out pretty close to Venus. It was like passing very, very closely to it. But now that orbit is taking it farther and farther and farther away each month. And this upcoming new moon that we're about to have, and then followed a couple days later by the first few phases of the moon, will be taking it very close to Venus for the last time before Venus sets and we can't see it at nighttime anymore. So if you keep watching the moon then rises and rises and rises, hits its first quarter phase, and then it hits its new phase, its full phase. And then as it's coming around through its third quarter phase, that's when the moon last week was passing by Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. And it actually basically stayed a day at each planet. It was moving through the sky, and then it hit Jupiter, then it hit Saturn, and then it hit Mars over the course of about 2 to 3 days. So the moon, due to its orbit, and due to the fact that the planets are very, very flat in their orbits, the moon comes very close to the planets that we see in the sky. And the thing about the planets and the moon, and the sun even, is living in the northern hemisphere, you have to be facing south. You have to be facing towards the equator in order to see them. So if you're facing those planets or the moon or the sun, you're pointing in some direction to the south. But let's flip this around. Let's say that you live in the southern hemisphere. If you live in the southern hemisphere, when you're looking at the sun, or if you're looking at the planets, or you're looking at the moon, you are facing some direction to the north. So depending on the hemisphere that you live in, you will notice that you're pointing a completely different direction, because the orbits all take them fairly close to our equator here on the Earth. And finally, just to pay attention to what side of you the sun and the moon and all the planets are on, you'll notice that in the northern hemisphere, when you're facing south, when you have east on your left and you have west off to your right. But if you live in the southern hemisphere, you have east off to your left, your right, and you have west off to your left. So even that is very different from here in the northern hemisphere. So I hope that's given you some things to think about as you're orienting yourself through the sky. I know it's very, very difficult right now with all these clouds to see any of the planets. Even Venus is probably not going to be visible tonight. We tried to watch a rocket launch earlier, but there was just too much of a haze to actually see the rocket launch from 150 miles away. But if you do get to see Jupiter, Saturn, if you wake up early enough in the night to see them right now until July when they're out at a reasonable hour, you will notice that you are facing some direction, and you can actually guide yourself. You can point yourself any direction you want just by paying attention to where the planets, the sun, and the moon are. So this will be the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoy that. And of course, hopefully I'll have a better update as to when Sidewalk Science Center will be back on the Riverwalk. Still shooting for early to mid-May right now, but that could change, of course. And I'll let you guys know when we get back out there, especially because I want to get the telescope back out, because with Venus starting to disappear, I want people to get their last views in, and then we have some of the other constellations that we're about to lose. But we'll have to see what happens, make the safest decision. And of course, hopefully everyone is staying healthy, staying safe, and to all our endeavors, because we have a future to create. I'm Alex Martin, and I'll see you guys later this week.